Thank you everybody for being here today. It's a real honor that you chose to spend part of the afternoon with us. So I'm going to say a few words, and after that, if anybody else would like to say a few words, you're more than welcome. I wanted to share some of my memories and some of what I had the chance to learn about my dad over the years with you all, because I think that there's when you live a life as long as his, there's a lot that people have one perspective, or they understand one facet of somebody's life that they've been a part of, but maybe not the totality of it. So I wanted to start with this equation. It's the only equation that you're going to be seeing in this presentation from me anyway. I don't know if anybody else brought some physics with them. This is an equation that explains how changing the angle of a magnetic field passing through certain superconductors can change how they behave. And it's one of my dad's more well-known professional contributions. And I can't really explain it to you at all. There are other people in the room who can do that. But I thought it was a useful metaphor to start because it actually, for me anyway, reflects how his life really looked very different depending on your point of view. And you don't need to understand any physics to appreciate that it points to a lifetime of curiosity, of study, and of deep understanding. And from the perspective through which all of us in this room knew him, he lived a quiet and humble life. But from another perspective, it was a life of holding on to a dream, overcoming tremendous challenges, and standing up to the powerful to write an amazing story. So I want to start with the man that we all knew. He was a man of not that many words, especially in the last dozen years after he had an infection that weakened his lungs. We knew him as unassuming. He lived in the same modest house for 40 years. He had a modest car in the driveway. He enjoyed simple pleasures, the latest Atlantic or a history book, a bowl of soup, always with a slice of bread on the side, biking to work, walking or skiing in the woods, depending on the season, or getting lost in a forest of Iowa corn. He loved to grill trout or steak over a homemade fire pit, whether it was raining or shining. And he loved to sit with a sheet of paper, a pen, and a furrowed brow, seeking to explain a surprising result from a physics experiment done half a world away. He was excited to meet the collaborator in person at a conference or a seminar somewhere, and he formed lifelong friendships with his colleagues. He always found time to explore nature, to hike, to scurry, to wade for miles and miles in a national park or nature preserve. At first glance, it was a very intellectually vibrant but unadorned life. But to know and remember him this way, as we all do, would be like judging an epic novel only by the cover of the final volume. Everyone here knew him only in the second half of his life. He left Russia at 38. He left Israel for Germany when he was 44, my mom now at his side. And by the time I arrived and he brought us to America and here to Ames, he was 45. That's an age that I only just caught up to a few months ago, just after he turned 90. So just as a superconductor can behave differently when the angle of the magnetic field changes, we also need to have a different perspective to complete our understanding and appreciation of my dad's life. So I want to share some of his stories from before that final volume and honor his magnificent, rich, and determined long adventure, and to understand just how extraordinary and hard-earned that quiet and humble life that we knew really was. So my father's mother, Ida, came from a shtetl called Rudnia in far western Russia. It was just a few miles from the border with Belarus. Her parents had a leather tannery with one employee, and that's who she married, my grandfather Gregory. My dad was born in their village in September of 1934. This is that village. But he grew up about 30 miles away in the regional capital of Smolensk, a small city of about 100,000 people in those days. And my grandfather worked there in a flour mill. When he was 7 years old, there we go. When he was 7 years old in 1941, the Germans invaded. His father was drafted the very same day. And a week before the invading army reached their city, his dad arranged for them to evacuate. An old colleague of his dad had a small truck that he had found for his own family and his own belongings, and had just enough space in the back for my dad, his brother, and their mother. They drove it for 2 days and boarded an empty freight train heading east away from the front lines. And for a month, they rode in this train. There we go. For a month, they rode in the train until they reached Nizhny Novgorod, which was called Gorky back in those days. It was a city about 500 miles east of where they were coming from, where they had relatives. And my dad remembered running for cover into a ditch several times when the Germans were trying to bomb the train. Now, Gorky was actually the heart of Russian industrial war production, and thus it was actually the target of some of the harshest strikes by the German Air Force of any industrial city in Russia. So it turned out not to be a great place to find yourself, and refugees like his family had to flee further to the east to a tiny collective farming village called Chinevo near Kazakhstan, about 1,600 miles from home. There, his uncle traded his blacksmithing skills for grain, milk, and eggs from the villagers. And that, along with the war rations that they got as refugees, which were animal feed, kept them alive during a near famine over an especially harsh winter. A few months later, his father returned from the front, and part of his leg had been blown off. But his injury may have actually saved his life. He was the first soldier in the village to return alive in a war that eventually killed about 10 million Soviet soldiers. Escaping the war was the first time my dad had to start over. Back in Smolensk, after 3 years away, my dad's family returned to a devastated city, even as the German night bombings continued. They discovered that my great-grandparents who had stayed behind had been killed by the Nazis, but somehow their cow had survived. And this was the view of the block that they came home to. They were lucky to find one room of their home still standing, but another family had moved in, and that single room became home to 7 people. And a few months later, a German bomb destroyed a box of my grandfather's valuable carpentry and cobblery tools, which he had been hoping to use to make a living after the war. So they had to rebuild their lives a second time. Now, my dad was 10 at this time, the same age as my son, Simon. But from his point of view, these hardships weren't actually exceptional. Of course, he was surrounded by this kind of deprivation, and his dad was still alive. They had a cow for milk and income, and eventually they even got a room of their own for the family to share. But 2 years later, another tragedy came. In 1946, my grandfather died of a heart attack in his sleep at age 42. My dad was 12, just a little bit older than my son, Abe, and the family was further impoverished, surviving another famine in 1947 that killed about 2 million people in Russia. Thanks largely to that cow and my grandmother's determination to work despite having no education or experience. Although life was very tough, my dad remembered high school very fondly. Teachers nurtured his love of literature, math, and most of all, of physics. He remembers a history teacher that encouraged critical thinking, even while teaching rigid propaganda. He and his friends always wondered how just one man, the father of the nations, Joseph Stalin, had answers to every possible question. In 1952, he graduated with this silver medal, which if you look at it closely later, you'll see is on a piece of paper that a graduate student, I think, in 2000 printed out of a scan of this medal that shows that it is essentially pure silver. So it's legit silver medal, which should have guaranteed entry to a top university in Moscow without having to take an exam. But at one of his college interviews, he faced what felt like a police interrogation. There was rising anti-Semitism in that time and strict limits enforced by the KGB on Jewish students, especially in physics. And that presented barriers to him everywhere. So he came back to Smolensk and enrolled at the Karl Marx Pedagogical Institute, a local teacher training college. Moscow and studying with the best minds in the country would have to wait. He loved college, but beyond academics and the usual student hijinks, physical education was really serious business there. His PE department organized a 3-week trek from Russia into Georgia and down to the Black Sea. And he did several of these treks in that time. His love of hiking and nature lasted a lifetime and ultimately led to me standing here today. After he graduated in 1956, he was assigned to teach at a high school in a small collective farming village near Smolensk, where he had his first taste of resisting state authority. Everyone in the village was taxed a portion of their farm animals, like the feudal tithes in Tsarist Russia. He wasn't a farmer, and he had no animals, so he refused to pay. He had a quick-thinking principal, however, who saved him by getting the party tax collector very drunk. Now, he spent those 2 years teaching while also preparing for graduate school, and he studied the works of Lev Landau, who was one of Russia's greatest physicists and later a Nobel Prize winner. He focused on a textbook not just because he loved the academics, but he also understood that it was politically a good choice because Landau's Institute in Moscow was one of the few programs, maybe the only program, that didn't require an applicant to prove their communist loyalty. You only had to pass a series of basically impossible exams. So he actually passed the first one, which was given by Landau personally in his apartment. But he failed one the next day, given by another future Nobel Prize winner, Alexei Abrikosov, who studied the branch of physics that my dad later dedicated his career to advancing. He was 24. Now, 53 years later, my dad met Abrikosov, here they are together, at a conference. And 8 years after that, over 6 decades after failing that exam, he won the Abrikosov Prize, honoring his contributions to the field. The picture on the right here is actually Lev Landau in the back, Abrikosov in the middle, and my dad on the right, which I thought was a nice summation of that intellectual journey. Back in 1958, at age 24, my dad finally did find a physics PhD program that would take him at the Moscow Pedagogical Institute. And so he finally made his way to Moscow. In a severely malnourished and undersupplied country, living in Moscow was an absolute dream. His memories centered on the rich musical life of the city, his social circle of singers, poets, and chess players, but he never really felt accepted by them, though he couldn't keep up with their drinking. He was a physics student, after all. He had a lot of work he had to do and to be able to concentrate. And after 4 years, his thesis defense approached, but fearing that he would be assigned to a remote college somewhere in Siberia, he made a dramatic decision and quit. So academic physics would have to wait. He was 28. Over the next 10 years, he took on various jobs as a prep school teacher, as a lecturer at the university, as a staff physicist at a rocket science research institute, all so that he could maintain what mattered most to him, the right to live in Moscow. He rented space to sleep on the floor of a friend's 6-by-9-foot room before he earned enough to rent a room of his own. And on the side, and for much more money than his formal work, he tutored the kids of the Moscow elite, including the daughter of a former KGB head who had attempted a coup, failed, and been executed. The consequences for resisting authority were really clear and severe, but nevertheless, he got involved in underground publishing. He would personally type banned literature on very thin carbon copy paper, 10 sheets at a time. And this is an example of one of the books that he typed. And if you look at it later, you'll see just how thin these pieces of paper are that they would print on and then distribute this to their friends and try to get the word out that not everything was as the government said. This is a Solzhenitsyn novel. In 1965, he had a dry spell in his work, and he decided to join a geological expedition in Siberia in the forest for about 4 months. And I was looking at the distances involved here. The distance between Moscow and where they did this expedition was actually This site is actually closer to Alaska, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and a lot of other places in Asia, closer than it is to Moscow. So it really is pretty far east in Siberia. Now, while he was there, his role was really to be a human pack mule. He walked 15 to 20 miles a day carrying rock samples through the virgin subalpine forest, sleeping on a bed of pine needles. And he absolutely loved this trip. He, in his recollections, focused a lot on the local workers that he hired or that his team hired along the way. There was an indigenous family that they met that was surviving on hunting and fishing. There was a former political prisoner from a nearby gulag who had gone all the way back to Ukraine, found he didn't know anyone back there. His wife had married somebody else, so he came back to where he'd been a prisoner because it was the life he now knew. Many other really remarkable stories from people in those days. And almost everybody was drinking as much as they could whenever they could get their hands on anything. It sounds like it was a pretty difficult place to be. Now, back in the early 70s, by the early 70s, back in Moscow, life was pretty bleak. Even in Moscow, which was the most progressive, the most cosmopolitan place in the vast country, it seemed to him that there wasn't much hope for change. And the years of anti-Semitism had really taken their toll on his belief in being able to continue to live there. He found a group of Jews that were fighting for emigration to Israel, and he eventually secured a visa. He was given 5 days to leave the country, and everyone he'd ever known, with no hope or expectation of ever returning. The reason for the rush was that the authorities wanted to avoid any disruptive behavior during Nixon and Kissinger's visit the following week. So his ability to escape, which he credited to American diplomacy, led to his lifelong positive feelings toward Nixon and Kissinger. Arriving in Israel, he started over for the third time. He learned Hebrew, he started a new PhD program, and this time he finished. He also hiked all over the country. One such hike was an overnight trek on the night of September 19th, 1975. It was his 41st birthday. A friend of my dad invited him along with a woman he wanted him to meet. They hiked under a full moon from the mountains south of Jerusalem down to a Dead Sea sunrise. Where his trek from the Caucasus Mountains to the Black Sea in college sparked his love of nature, this hike from the mountains to another sea sparked a different kind of love. And 2 years later, they were married. After completing his PhD, he took a postdoc position in Stuttgart for a couple of years in Germany, and I arrived a few months before that ended. And through the efforts of a collaborator, he secured another postdoc in a faraway country, in a faraway town called Ames. That colleague, dearly departed John Clem, became a lifelong family friend. And thus in 1980, at 45, my dad started his life over again for the fourth time, and just as I was starting out for the first time. Within a few years, excuse me, within a few years, he finally secured his goal of over 30 years, a permanent position as a research scientist. Having worked so hard for so long to reach it, he held on to his research interests even after formally retiring at 84 until his final days. Most of what I've shared today is taken from stories that he wrote down in the last 15 years, hoping to leave a sense of his history for his descendants that he had never had about his own ancestors. Of his own journey, he wrote, "I was like a wood chip in the stormy sea. Though badly beaten, I survived many storms. So a quiet and humble life it was not." If we view it from the right angle, the quiet that he found in the simple pleasures of family, of nature, and intellectual challenge in a small Midwestern college town 5,000 miles from Moscow was a monumental achievement. He didn't care for money, material possessions, or social status. He even turned down a promotion once to avoid having to do more paperwork. Sounds like a few of you may have done the same. Chekhov once wrote that true talent always sits in the shade, mingles with the crowd, and avoids the limelight. If the measure of a man is how far he reaches beyond the starting line, the strangers that he helps along the way, who have become lifelong friends, the stock that he adds to the store of human knowledge, and the beauty he found in nature and human creativity, without falling for the artifice of ephemeral status or ego, or bowing to power, or bending to anyone else's notion of success, then my dad was a giant. My dad once questioned how he had come so far. Quote, I write this in a flourishing place of indescribable beauty in the mountains of northern Italy. From the gray and poor Russian city of Smolensk, how did destiny bring me so far? Do I deserve it? I'd like to believe, but all my long life, I never needed something like Tintoretto or even Michelangelo's Lord in my private decisions or in my work. Still, I am moved by what we see all around. People cannot accept that human life has as much meaning and purpose as that of trees or rabbits. Should the state take from its people their right to a dream, as happened in the USSR of my youth? Of course not. It is nice to have a story. Otherwise, what remains are atoms and their interactions. That is, roughly speaking, physics. Thank you, Dad, for your story. If anybody else feels called to say anything, you're more than welcome. And of course, you're welcome to stay as long as you like and mingle and remember. So thank you very much for coming.
Hello, my name is Anat Shinar, and my parents are Ruth and Joe Shinar, and we grew up with Hetty and Volodya and Uri like family. And my parents are in California, and they are not able to be here, but they wrote something that they asked me to read. Hopefully I can get through it. After a long flight from balmy Tel Aviv on Friday, January 25th, 1985, we arrived in Ames the following day. One of our very first welcomes was by Eti and Vladimir Kogan at their home. At that time, they were noting Volodya's 50th birthday, and we were sure this was a mistake and that they meant his 40th birthday. After that first meeting, Eti and Volodya quickly became close friends. Our families met often over the years for holiday celebrations, Passover seders, afternoon coffee, tea, and cake, and dinners in general. We invariably had a great time together. We loved discussions with Eti and Volodya, history, politics, Israel, and of course, physics. Looking back, Volodya's life was an amazing combination of hardship and resilience. After a very recent conversation, I, Ruti, my mother, started to write my family stories. The conversation that was the fact that 8-year-old grandkids have decided that they have reached the age when they deserve their own room. Volodya told us how at that age, and later he slept in a narrow bed with his brother, facing opposite directions. He continued to tell us the story of his family during and after World War II, how as a 6-year-old, he escaped with his family from his hometown toward the Ural Mountains, how they lived as refugees in that area, how they grew tobacco, and how they returned to their hometown after it was liberated. In particular, he recalled that he was entrusted with carrying the treasured tobacco in his backpack, only to discover that during a transit between trains, his backpack was slit open and the tobacco was stolen. We loved his unbelievable stories and storytelling way, his sense of humor, his soft-spoken manner, and witty style. Volodya was one of those rare physicists who were interested in science only. He did not care if he was an adjunct associate professor or full professor. He simply removed himself from that and dug deeply into his physics research. As such, following his passion, I don't believe he ever got into conflicts with colleagues or friends. We will miss Volodya, our frequent get-togethers, our conversations, our joint meals. Our kids will miss Volodya, and we were fortunate that even 2 of our grandkids, those are my kids, got to know him. Life is going to change for us, and it's still hard to accept it. We love you and hug you, Eti, Uri, and family. Volodya will live forever in our hearts.
I'm not good at remembering things. So I will not surprise you with the extraordinary stories today. Still, I will share a brief reflection on my long friendship with Volodya. We shared an office for nearly 20 years, always on good terms. And in all that time, there was not a single event that stood out, basically. We had really a cordial relationship and good relationship at work. though I occasionally interrupted him to hear stories from his youth, and thank you, Ori, for actually reminding me of these stories in the Soviet Union, I assure you that my timing was always strategic. I only spoke when he took breaks, and the evidence for that, his productivity was really not good at that time. So Volodya was older than me, and I was always intrigued by his life experiences, the hardships of World War II at young age, and his fearless acts like typewriting and distributing Solzhenitsyn and encountering great minds like Lev Landau, and of his hiking on the Caucasus or Caucasus Mountain. I wish I had taken notes or even recorded those conversations. I remember many, but the details fade with time. In his early years as a physicist, Volodya was deeply interested, and this is maybe something new for you guys, he was deeply interested in the origin of the Earth's magnetic field. A fundamental problem he considered. Later, his focus shifted to superconductivity, and later his focus shifted toward problems in superconductivity. And I guess he did so well there that he forgot about that thing. Where at one point he basically showed me, actually, I'm getting lost in the reading, but at one point he showed me actually a file or a folder that he actually worked on magnetic field of the Earth, the geomagnetic field of the Earth, and he never went back to it. At some point after his retirement, I actually teased him and I said, Volodya, now you are actually free. You can actually work on this geomagnetism. But he just gave a smile, and he was practical, and he continued basically to work on whatever he knew how to be productive, and that was superconductivity. We had actually an interaction or a meeting with Volodya just on New Year's Day, and he was as sharp as he always was. He was frail, but he was sharp. He was reading and discussing things, and I will always remember he was frail. His body maybe gave up, but his mind was actually still working as usual and in a good way. So I will always remember him like that. He was a good friend of ours. Eddie was a good friend of us, and we will always remember him as the way he was when he was alive. He was a good friend.
My name is Ruslan Prozorov, and I was lucky to know Vladimir for his work mostly, but also I arrived in Ames in 2005, and we almost immediately clicked because my background was in vortex physics, something that he was mostly involved with in his professional life. And I'm experimentalist, and he's a theorist, was a theorist, and he loved writing equations, as Uri showed this. And this is what we call analytical theorist, and which means you derive equations, and then these equations have to be solved. And these equations, if I translate directly from Russian, would be called fly-killing equations. And that means practically unsolvable. And so I liked numerical methods with computers, and I would take his equations and solve, produce some curves, show back to him. Usually in the first attempt, it made no sense. And because in physics, you always know what you expect, more or less. And if you produce something, when you put the input, which you know should bring to something specific and don't get it, it means the equations are not working. And then it's either equation is wrong or my numerical solutions are wrong. And this forcing back been our more trend since then. We published a few papers a year until this year. The last paper just came out, and I currently have a draft, which I will publish, that we started working on together and unfortunately did not finish. And so my personal experience with Vladimir is as a good friend and colleague. And while he was moving along in these 20 years, which I knew him, aging and changing positions, eventually retiring, for me, it didn't happen because we've been in touch with him. I've been in touch with him practically, if not daily, then weekly. And we always last email exchange was in January, and it was a really forth and back interaction, and in a very small detail that needs attention. And or of course during these years we got to know each other much better, and the family, we would visit Eti and Vladimir at their home and talk about different things. And of course, a lot of it was about physics. But I'm very glad that I could have such a good time with such a wonderful person who, as everybody here says, that was humble and very kind, but he was also very strong in his opinions as far as rights and wrongs are concerned, especially the regime which we all left behind in Soviet Union. And that belief was, he was really whole in a sense that the integral person that without flaws basically. And while leading simple life, I think that's what he enjoyed. And I know for a fact that the ability to work till the very end and write those equations and keep working in that way was the blessing for him, and he wouldn't trade it for anything else. So he'll be missed.
Hello, my name is Irina. I came to this country about 25 years ago. And several days after my arrival, I met Volodya. I and Sergei, my husband-to-be, we were invited to Volodya's house for New Year celebration. I had jet lag. I didn't really speak English well. But when we came to this house, immediately I felt at home. Atmosphere was so warm and people were so kind. And whatever I couldn't say in English, I could say in Russian. We had just fabulous night. And we became friends. And since then, we had many celebrations together. We celebrated our wedding. We celebrated our birthdays. So many New Year celebrations. And Volodya was always part of them. I remember him coming to our house, bringing this huge, beautiful bouquets of flowers. And we always loved having him with us. And we always enjoyed his stories. And they were always interesting, entertaining, and funny, and educational. We actually learned a lot from these stories about Volodya's life in Soviet Union, in Israel, in Germany, and actually about life of other people in our own country. We had a lot in common. Sergei loved literature, history, art, music, nature, cross-country skiing, riding a bicycle to work, tea, mushrooms. And we are from Belarus, so we really love mushrooms. And one day I remember how Volodya called us and he said, "Oh, I found these wild mushrooms in one of Ames parks. I think they are edible. They look like exactly the same as mushrooms that we had in Soviet Union." He said, "I picked up some, but I left plenty for you, just come." Of course, we came, we picked up these mushrooms, and and this started a new tradition in our family. Every summer we go to Ames parks looking for these wild mushrooms. And sometimes we find some mushrooms that we are not 100% sure that what they are. Other people don't know, even if they are edible. Even university extension specialists didn't know what they are. But we were thinking they're okay. But because other people had doubts, we had our doubts too. So we were always thinking, okay, we need to decide who is the less valuable member of our family to sacrifice that he or she will eat these mushrooms first. And of course, we never could decide. And we were eating them together at the same time. But before we were doing this, we always had this conversation. We need to talk, to call somebody so that they can check on us later on next day. And whom to call. So we looked at each other and we were smiling. And of course, we were saying, let's call Volodya. So every time we were suspicious about foreign food, unusual foods that we ever had, we were saying this, let's call Volodya. We never did. We never called him about this matter, and we always survived all our culinary experiences. But Volodya really was, for us, the first person to go to when we needed help. Volodya was very kind, a very intelligent person, very gentle. He was a real gentleman. And Last time we celebrated New Year together was 2019. And of course, Volodya was there. And I invited all our guests again to come next year to celebrate. And then you know what happened, pandemic. And we didn't see each other so often. And after pandemic, things were not the same. And unfortunately, people were afraid to go to other people's houses and invite people to their houses, and especially people who were older than we were. Many years were taken from us by pandemic. But Volodya survived pandemic, as he survived so many other storms in his life. And last year we celebrated his 90th birthday. And again, we met again about a month ago in our other friend's house for 70th birthday of another friend. And Volodya was there, and he was so happy that he could come. He enjoyed the party, he enjoyed the food, the company, the conversation. And we were so glad to see him in actually good health. And when we were leaving, we hugged him, as we always did. We were never thinking that it was the last time we saw him and that it was the last hug. But even he is gone, we loved him so much, and we will miss him so much. And even he is not with us anymore, he will always live in our hearts, and we will always remember our dear friend, Vladimir Kogan.
Hi, I'm Paul Canfield. I'm an experimentalist. Volodya was a theorist. He taught me the joy of what physics should be, in the sense that when we had results we didn't understand, we could go to him, discuss them. He would be interested. He would come up with theories. We could test them. We could give him challenges. He would come back. It was a dance. And it's the type of dance in your career that you just live for. Seryoja and I enjoyed 4 or 5 years of just back and forth with Volodya. And it was some of the most enjoyable times of my life. So he was able to really give pleasure in that sense. He was a mensch. He would tell stories to my children about samizdat and his publishing and other things. In Ames High School, they had to interview someone, and Volodya was one that one of my boys interviewed. And I offer one small correction to what Yuri described. He had his father being moderate and not drinking when others were enjoying. For many years, my house was a dry house, but I would cook with alcohols. And when we'd have parties at my house, Volodya would go, "My throat is a little dry. Perhaps you can find me something for it." And he would deeply enjoy sharing drinks and telling stories. But he did enjoy his drink a little bit, and it was a pleasure to give it to him. Volodya is just one of the shining people in my career. I was so happy to have decades with him. And as everyone else, I will miss him, but I will cherish the time I had with him. So there we go.
Hello, everyone here and everyone online. My name is Franek Hasiuk. I'm one of Uri's friends from high school and the family's friend for several decades now. I knew Volodya off and on throughout my time coming back and forth to Ames, and I really enjoyed his company and his counsel. When I think Uri gave a great expose of his life, and when I look at that and I think, if that was a Hollywood movie, who would that be played by? I think if you told someone that story, they would think, who is this superhero that you're talking about? And if you said, here's a picture of this superhero, they'd say, no, this couldn't be that guy. I think a lot of times we forget what heroes look like. And if you look at what he experienced and the tough decisions he had to make and how he ended up, Uri had a complicated equation at the beginning of all this, right? Volodya solved another equation, right? Which was how to get through all that and still be this wonderful person at his core who influenced all the people here, all the people online, and the people that couldn't make it here today. And for me, he's a hero. And I'm always going to remember that anyone can make these difficult decisions and make them the right way, and still at the end of all of it, have just joy in his heart. Because that's the one thing I remember from him. He was maybe small in stature, but he was like, I was thinking about this just when I was sitting over there. He's the embodiment of that phrase, larger than life, right? He was not a big guy, but when I remember him, he was huge. And we can see all that he's accomplished and all the people that he's touched throughout his life. So I just wanted to say that. Uri, thanks for the wonderful words. It was great to see that his life story. And I think his joy, has lived on in all of us, and hopefully it will. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your warm memories and really heartwarming. I think that unless anybody else wants to say anything, we can wrap it there. And obviously, for those of you who are here, did you want to say something? What?
Just to say thank you.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who came. It was heavy on physics, the talks, but and some people that came didn't really know Volodya, but they came for me and really moved. And thank you, everyone, for all the good friends and help and good memories, and especially to the 3 youngish people who came from out of town. One flew from Albuquerque, and 2 came from Minneapolis. And it really means a lot to me. Thank you.